confident that a foreign tongue would easily mask his cruelty. Marco's most dangerous man sneered at the plus-size waitress, pouring his scotch, and insulted her in perfect Arabic. What he certainly didn't anticipate was for her to lean in, smile, and call him a coward in the exact same dialect. The Crystal Room was the kind of high-end, velvet-draped establishment where a single bottle of champagne cost more than Penelope Gallagher's rent. At 28, Penelope, Penny to the few people who actually bothered to ask her name, knew exactly how she was perceived in a place like this. She was a fat woman in a sea of razor-thin hostesses and stiletto-wearing socialites. She didn't have the delicate, bird-like frame the management usually hired to serve the VIP tables. She had wide hips, thick thighs, and a soft belly hidden beneath the restrictive black corset of her uniform. But Penny was also the most efficient server on the floor, possessing a steel-trap memory and an uncanny ability to read the room. She owned her body, even on the days when the wealthy clientele looked right through her, or worse, looked at her with blatant disdain. Tonight, the air in the restaurant was thick with a different kind of tension. Simon, the usually composed floor manager, was sweating through his bespoke suit. "Table 4, Simon whispered frantically, grabbing Penny by the elbow near the service station. "The Romano party. Only you, Penny. No one else approaches that table. Do not make eye contact unless addressed. Do not linger." Penny grabbed her silver tray. "Romano, as in Ezekiel Romano." Simon just nodded, his face pale. Everyone in the city knew the name. Ezekiel Romano wasn't just old money. He was blood money. He was the young, ruthless head of a syndicate that controlled the ports, the unions, and half the politicians in the state. He was a ghost in the tabloids, but a god in the underworld. Balancing a tray with 4 glasses of 50-year-old Macallan, Penny navigated the crowded floor. As she approached the secluded, dimly lit alcove, she felt the temperature drop. 4 men sat at the table, exuding an aura of lethal indifference. At the center sat Ezekiel Romano. He was strikingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features, dark hair swept back, and eyes as cold and gray as a winter storm. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. Beside him was his underboss, a scarred man named Leo, who was currently scanning the room with the paranoia of a hunted animal. Penny stepped up to the table. "Good evening, gentlemen. You're Macallan." She moved smoothly, placing the crystal glasses down with practiced grace. As she leaned over Ezekiel's glass in front of him, her hip brushed against the edge of the heavy mahogany table. It was a minor thing, a hazard of navigating tight spaces in a body that took up room. Ezekiel didn't even look up at her face. His cold eyes tracked the movement of her body, his expression twisting into a sneer of profound disgust. He leaned back in his leather booth, picking up his glass, and turned to Leo. "Unzur ilayha," Ezekiel said smoothly, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "هل بدأوا في توظيف البقر هنا؟ لا أستطيع أن أشك طريقي من خلال الشهم. إجلها تضرب. أريد شخصا لا يتحرك مثل الخنزير." It was flawless Levantine Arabic. The translation was as brutal as the delivery. "Look at her. Are they hiring cattle here now? I can't breathe through the fat. Get rid of her. I want someone who doesn't waddle like a pig." Leo chuckled darkly, sipping his drink. They assumed she was just a working-class American girl. They assumed her world was small, her education limited, and her comprehension non-existent. They thought the barrier of language was an impenetrable shield for their cruelty. Penny froze for a microsecond. A hot, familiar flash of humiliation burned in her chest, quickly followed by a blinding white-hot rage. Years ago, before a scandal had destroyed her family's finances and forced her into the service industry, Penny had lived a vastly different life. Her father had been a high-ranking diplomat stationed in Beirut and Amman. Penny hadn't just learned Arabic. She had lived it, breathed it, and translated it for high-security briefings when she was just out of college. She finished setting down the last napkin. Slowly, she stood up straight. She didn't shrink. She didn't apologize. She squared her broad shoulders, letting her full presence command the space, and looked directly into Ezekiel Romano's slate-gray eyes. "Al-Baqarah tasma'uk jida," Penny said, her voice eerily calm and her accent impeccable. "The cattle can hear you perfectly." Ezekiel's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. The air in the booth seemed to vaporize. Leo's hand dropped instantly below the table, undoubtedly resting on the grip of a concealed weapon. Penny didn't break eye contact with the Mafia Boss. She leaned in closer, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the sharp tang of the whiskey. وَهَمَّهَا الرَّجُلَ الَّذِي يَخْتَبِي خَلْفَ لُغَلِهَنَتْ امرأة لا يتوقع منها أن تفهمه هو ليس رجلا قويا, she continued smoothly, her tone dripping with venom. إنه جابا صغير ومتكبر. And a man who hides behind a language to insult a woman he expects not to understand him is not a strong man. He is a coward, a small, arrogant coward. Silence slammed into the alcove. It was so absolute it rang in Penny's ears. She gave him a polite, chillingly professional smile. "Enjoy your scotch, Mr. Romano. If you need anything else, I suggest you ask for it in English. It requires less hiding." She turned on her heel and walked away, her spine straight, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She fully expected a bullet in the back of her head. You didn't call the head of the Romano family a coward and walk away. But as she retreated into the safety of the swinging kitchen doors, the bullet never came. Back at the table, Ezekiel Romano sat frozen. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked on the spot where the heavy-set waitress had just stood. "Boss," Leo growled, half rising from his seat. "I'll drag her out back right now." "Disrespectful. Sit down, Leo," Ezekiel snapped, his voice dangerously low. "But Ezekiel," I said, "sit down." Ezekiel took a slow sip of his Macallan. His heart was beating with an unfamiliar rhythm. He had been insulted before. He had been threatened by cartels and rival dons. But he had never been stripped down and intellectually humiliated by a waitress in a corseted uniform. The sheer audacity of it, the flawless pronunciation of her Arabic, the fire in her eyes when she refused to let her body be a punchline. It was intoxicating. "Find the manager," Ezekiel ordered, his eyes tracking the swinging kitchen doors. "Tell him that Waitress is serving us for the rest of the night, exclusively. If anyone else brings a plate to this table, I'll burn this restaurant to the ground." 10 minutes later, Simon shoved Penny back through the kitchen doors. "I don't know what you did, but he requested you," Simon hissed, terrified. "Just you. Pour his water, smile, and for the love of God, Penny, survive the shift." Penny adjusted her apron. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she clamped down on the fear. She was tired of shrinking to make other people comfortable. If Ezekiel Romano wanted to intimidate her, he was going to have to try harder than a stare down. She approached the table with a pitcher of iced water. The 3 bodyguards watched her with open hostility, but Ezekiel watched her with calculated curiosity. It felt like being studied by a wolf. "So," Ezekiel said in English as she filled his glass, "where does a waitress in Marco learn to speak Levantine Arabic with the accent of a diplomat?" "Books," Penny lied smoothly, not looking up. "You're lying," Ezekiel said. He rested his elbows on the table, leaning into her space. "It takes years of immersion to speak with that kind of natural cadence. Who are you hiding from, Penelope?" She paused, glancing at his manicured hands. He had read her name tag. "I'm not hiding from anyone, Mr. Romano. I'm trying to make rent. Now, would you like to order your entrees, or would you prefer to keep insulting me in languages I supposedly don't understand?" A dark, genuine smirk tugged at the corner of Ezekiel's mouth. "I apologize for the insult. It was crude, and it was cowardly." Penny blinked, momentarily disarmed. The apology was the last thing she expected. It didn't make him a good man, but it made him a dangerous one capable of shifting tactics. "Apology acknowledged," Penny said cautiously. "The stakes are excellent tonight." "I don't care about the stakes," Ezekiel said softly. "I care about why a woman with your intellect and linguistic skills is wiping down tables and taking abuse from men like me." "Men like you are exactly why I'm here," Penny shot back, the words out of her mouth before she could stop them. "My father was caught in a crossfire in Beirut because syndicates like yours couldn't agree on shipping routes. The government disavowed him. We lost everything. So yes, I wipe tables, because honest money lets me sleep at night." Ezekiel's eyes darkened. He finally had a piece of the puzzle. He opened his mouth to reply, but the words never came. The front windows of the crystal room didn't just break. They exploded. A shower of tempered glass rained over the dining room, followed instantly by the deafening roar of automatic gunfire. Screams erupted as patrons dove under tables. The tranquil velvet-draped sanctuary turned into a war zone in less than a second. "Down!" Leo roared, flipping the heavy mahogany table onto its side to create a barricade. Ezekiel grabbed Penny by the wrist and yanked her down just as a line of bullets shredded the leather booth where she had been standing. She hit the carpet hard, the breath knocked out of her lungs. "Falcone's men!" one of the bodyguards shouted over the din, returning fire with a suppressed pistol. "They flanked the entrance, boss! We're pinned!" Ezekiel cursed violently in Italian. He pulled a compact Glock from his holster, checking the chamber. He looked at Penny, who was huddled against the overturned table, covering her head. "Are you hit?" he shouted over the gunfire. "No!" Penny gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Leo, we need an exit. The back alley," Ezekiel commanded. "They'll have it covered," Leo yelled, firing blind over the table. "They came to wipe us out, Gabe. It's a trap." Suddenly, a bullet tore through the wooden barricade. Ezekiel grunted, his shoulder jerking violently backward. Blood instantly blossomed across his pristine charcoal suit. "Ezekiel!" Leo screamed. Penny stared at the blood. The trauma of her past, the memories of her father's death in a dusty street in Beirut, threatened to paralyze her. But then, a primal survival instinct kicked in. She knew this building better than anyone. She knew the blind spots, the renovations, and the structural quirks. "The kitchen is a dead end," Penny yelled, grabbing Ezekiel's uninjured arm. "They'll bottleneck you in the alley. We have to go down." Ezekiel winced, pressing a hand to his bleeding shoulder. "Down?" To the basement? The wine cellar connects to the old Prohibition tunnels. The city sealed them, but Simon knocked a hole through the drywall to store extra kegs last month. It leads to the subway grates 2 blocks over. Ezekiel looked at her, his grey eyes searching her face amidst the chaos. He was bleeding out, surrounded by enemies, placing his life in the hands of the fat waitress he had insulted 20 minutes ago. "Lead the way," he rasped. "Covering fire!" Leo roared to the remaining men. Penny scrambled to her feet, staying low. She wasn't small, but she was strong, and adrenaline gave her a terrifying speed. She hauled Ezekiel up, letting him lean some of his heavy, muscular weight against her side. "Go, go, go!" she screamed. They sprinted through the service doors, dodging terrified kitchen staff and flying pots. The gunfire followed them, echoing off the stainless steel appliances. 2 masked gunmen kicked through the kitchen doors just as Penny and Ezekiel reached the basement stairs. Ezekiel turned, firing twice. Both men dropped, but Ezekiel's arm gave out, the Glock clattering down the concrete stairs. "Leave it," Penny said, dragging him down the narrow stairwell. They reached the basement, a sprawling, dark labyrinth of wine racks and cold storage. Blood was dripping from Ezekiel's fingers, leaving a trail on the dusty floor. "They'll track the blood," Ezekiel panted, slumping against a brick wall. His face was losing color fast. "Go. Leave me here. You can fit through the tunnel. If they catch you with me, they'll skin you alive." Penny looked at him. He was offering her an out. She was a nobody. If she ran, she might just survive. But she looked at the blood soaking his shirt, and a stubborn, defiant fire lit in her chest. "I don't waddle, Mr. Romano," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "And I don't run away." She grabbed a heavy iron crowbar resting near the kegs and smashed the padlock on the massive, walk-in meat freezer. She hauled the heavy steel door open, a blast of sub-zero air hitting them in the face. "Inside," she commanded. Ezekiel looked at the freezer. "We'll freeze to death." "The ambient temperature will slow your bleeding," Penny said, dragging him inside. "And the insulated steel walls are bulletproof. They won't see your heat signature if they have thermal optics." She pulled him into the freezing darkness, pulling the heavy door shut behind them just as heavy boots pounded down the basement stairs. They were plunged into absolute pitch-black silence, surrounded by hanging cuts of meat and biting frost. Penny sank to the floor next to Ezekiel, the temperature immediately biting through her thin uniform. Ezekiel shifted in the dark, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He reached out with his uninjured hand, his fingers brushing against her arm in the dark. "You saved my life," he whispered, his arrogant exterior entirely shattered. "Don't thank me yet," Penny said, her teeth beginning to chatter. "We still have to survive the night." The cold inside the industrial meat freezer was an aggressive living thing. It gnawed at Penny's bare arms and seeped through the thin fabric of her uniform, turning the sweat on her skin into a layer of frost. Above them, the heavy carcasses of beef swayed slightly in the pitch black, brushing against them like dead sentinels. Ezekiel's breathing was growing shallow. The ambient temperature was slowing his blood flow, but it wasn't enough. If he went into shock, he would die on the icy floor, and Penny would be trapped in a steel tomb. "I need to apply a tourniquet," Penny whispered, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form the words. "Can't see a damn thing," Ezekiel ground out. His voice was losing its baritone edge, replaced by a terrifying fragility. Penny didn't hesitate. She reached around to the back of her uniform and began tearing at the laces of the restrictive black corset she was forced to wear. The thick, reinforced fabric would work perfectly. She yanked the garment off, feeling a brief, startling rush of freedom as her body expanded to its natural shape in the dark, before the biting cold rushed in to take its place. She felt blindly in the dark, her hands tracking up Ezekiel's chest, sticky with cooling blood, until she found his shoulder. "This is going to hurt," she warned. Ezekiel let out a sharp, breathless laugh. "I think we're past the point of gentle, Penelope." She looped the heavy corset lacing around his upper arm, right above the bullet wound, and pulled with all her strength. Ezekiel bit back a scream, his uninjured hand flying out and gripping her thigh like a vice. He squeezed his eyes shut, trembling violently as she tied the knot tight. "Done," she panted, slumping back against a frozen pallet of goods. They sat in silence, the only sound the ragged synchronization of their breathing. Ezekiel's hand remained resting heavily on her thigh. He didn't pull away, and to her own surprise, Penny didn't ask him to. The heat radiating from her body was the only thing keeping the sub-zero air from consuming him completely. "For what it's worth," Ezekiel rasped, breaking the heavy silence, "I was wrong. About everything. You were a snob," Penny corrected gently, wrapping her arms around her thick waist to preserve her core temperature. "And a bully." "I was blind," he countered, his thumb weakly stroking the fabric over her leg. "My world is full of manufactured perfection. Plastic women, hollow men. I saw you, and I saw something real. It irritated me because it reminded me of how fake my own existence is. So I attacked it." Penny blinked into the darkness. The confession was stark, stripped of all the mafia posturing. "You insulted my body because you were having an existential crisis? That's a terrible excuse, Mr. Romano." "Ezekiel," he whispered. "Call me Ezekiel." Before Penny could reply, the heavy, muffled thump of boots echoed from the outside. The hitmen were in the basement. Ezekiel went completely rigid. He pulled Penny down, dragging her heavy, warm body directly against his side, shielding her with his uninjured shoulder. It was a fiercely protective gesture that made Penny's heart skip a beat. They held their breath as the muffled voices bled through the heavy steel door. "Check the freezer," a muffled voice shouted in Italian. Penny's blood ran cold. But then another voice echoed. "No time. Sirens. The cops are swarming Michigan Avenue. We have to bounce before CPD locks down the grid." The heavy footsteps retreated, thundering back up the wooden stairs. They waited 10 agonizing minutes, shivering uncontrollably, until the silence felt permanent. Penny pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest, and shoved the heavy inner release latch of the freezer door. Warm air hit them like a physical blow. Penny gasped, dragging Ezekiel out of the icebox. His lips were a dangerous shade of blue. "Come on," Penny urged, throwing his good arm over her broad shoulders. "We have to move." She led him to the far wall of the cellar, grabbing the discarded crowbar. With 3 heavy swings, she smashed through the flimsy drywall Simon had erected. Behind it lay the mouth of the old Prohibition-era tunnels, smelling of damp earth and century-old secrets. They stumbled into the darkness, navigating by the faint glow of street grates far above. The journey felt like an eternity. Penny's body ached, but her sheer physical endurance, the very strength Ezekiel had mocked, was the only thing keeping them moving. They finally emerged through a rusted grate into the cavernous, concrete labyrinth of Lower Wacker Drive. The subterranean street was mostly empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of sodium lights. A sleek black SUV suddenly careened around the concrete pillars, tires screeching. Penny raised the crowbar, ready to fight, but the doors flew open to reveal Leo. I was covered in soot and blood, but alive. "Ezekiel!" Leo shouted, rushing forward to take his boss's weight from Penny. He looked at the bloody corset wrapped around Ezekiel's arm, then looked up at the exhausted, freezing Waitress. His eyes, previously filled with suspicion, now held nothing but absolute reverence. "Get him to Dr. Rossi at Rush," Penny gasped, stepping back. "Tell him it's a through and through, but he lost a lot of blood." Ezekiel fought to keep his eyes open as Leo bundled him into the back seat. He reached out, his bloody hand catching Penny's wrist. "Don't disappear," Ezekiel commanded, his voice a ghost of its former power. Penny pulled her hand away, offering him a sad, tired smile. "Goodbye, Ezekiel." 3 weeks later, Penny was officially unemployed. The Crystal Room had been cordoned off as a crime scene, and the restaurant group had quietly filed for bankruptcy. She was sitting in her cramped second-floor apartment in Pilsen, staring at a stack of final notices, when a heavy knock rattled her front door. She opened it to find a massive wall of muscle in a tailored suit. It was Leo. "Miss Gallagher," Leo said gruffly, removing his sunglasses. He bowed his head slightly, a sign of deep respect in his world. "Mr. Romano requests your presence." "I'm not going anywhere, Leo," Penny said, crossing her arms. "Please," Leo said, his voice softening. "He won't take no for an answer. And frankly, we owe you our lives. Just 1 hour." Reluctantly, Penny agreed. She was driven out to a sprawling, highly secure estate in Winnetka, overlooking Lake Michigan. The compound was beautiful, serene, and fortified like a military bunker. Leo led her to a sunlit conservatory at the back of the house. Ezekiel was sitting at a glass table, reviewing a stack of shipping manifests. His left arm was in a sling, and he looked slightly paler, but the lethal, commanding aura had completely returned. He looked up as she entered, and the air immediately vanished from the room. His cold grey eyes swept over her, but this time there was no disgust. There was only heat, and a hunger he didn't bother to hide. Penny was wearing a simple, curve-hugging, emerald green dress, her dark hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked beautiful, formidable, and utterly unbothered. "You didn't disappear," Ezekiel said softly, standing up. "Your goon didn't give me much of a choice," Penny replied, stepping into the room. "How's the arm?" "Healing, thanks to you." Ezekiel gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit with me." Penny sat, keeping her posture perfect. "If this is a thank you, I accept. You can wire a severance package to my bank account, and we can go our separate ways." "That's not going to happen," Ezekiel said, leaning forward. He slid a thick manila folder across the glass table. "I looked into your father, Arthur Gallagher, a brilliant diplomat. He was working on a peace treaty in Beirut that would have severely damaged a rival syndicate's smuggling routes. That's why he was killed, and that's why the government swept it under the rug." Penny's breath hitched. She stared at the folder, years of unresolved grief and anger bubbling to the surface. "How did you get this?" "I have resources," Ezekiel said. "I also know that you speak Arabic, French, Farsi, and Italian. I know you graduated top of your class before your father died, and that you've been hiding your brilliance behind an apron because you despise power. I despise corruption, Penny corrected fiercely. Then help me clean it up, Ezekiel said, his voice deadly serious. The Romano family is bleeding. Falcone's attack was a declaration of war, and he's using the same international smuggling routes that killed your father. I need a translator, a strategist, and an advisor I can trust implicitly. I need you. Penny stared at him, stunned. You want me to work for the mob? I want you to work for me, Ezekiel corrected, to help me dismantle the men who destroyed your family. Name your salary. Whatever it is, I'll triple it. Penny stood up, pacing the length of the conservatory. It was dangerous. It was insane. It went against everything she had promised herself. But the thought of finally taking down the ghosts of her past was an intoxicating drug. She turned back to him. If I do this, it's strictly business, and I don't fetch coffee. I don't bow to your men. And if you ever insult me or anyone else based on how they look, I will walk out and take your secrets with me. Ezekiel stood, walking slowly across the room until he was standing mere inches from her. The height difference forced her to look up into his striking face. He reached out with his uninjured hand, gently cupping her jaw. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, his eyes dropping to the full curve of her lips. I have spent the last 3 weeks thinking about nothing but you, Ezekiel murmured, his voice a dark, velvet confession. Thinking about how you looked me in the eye and put me in my place. Thinking about how perfectly you fit in my arms in the dark. I am a deeply flawed man, Penelope, but I am not a fool twice. You are the most magnificent woman I have ever met. Penny's heart hammered against her ribs, the same way it had during the firefight, but for an entirely different reason. She didn't pull away from his touch. She leaned into it, just a fraction, matching his intense gaze. Business, Ezekiel, she breathed, though her voice betrayed a tremor of desire. Ezekiel smiled, a genuine, breathtaking expression that transformed his face. He leaned down, his lips brushing softly against the corner of her mouth, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core. Kamatashayin, ya malikati, Ezekiel whispered in flawless Arabic against her skin. As you wish, my queen. Penny smiled, wrapping her hand over his. She had walked into a restaurant as a waitress, and she was walking out as the architect of an empire. Did this gripping tale of survival, respect, and unexpected romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved watching Penny put a ruthless mafia boss in his place and change her destiny, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this story with someone who loves a fierce heroine, and subscribe to our channel for more intense, dramatic stories where brains and bravery always win. What should Penny do next? Drop a comment below.